I've been in the RC hobby for many years, and the one thing that I hear that most people dislike the most is building shocks. They're messy, they leak, and getting them to be smooth can be a struggle. But today I'm going to share with you my tips that I've learned to make them buttery smooth and leak resistant. So whether they're pre-assembled or fresh from a kit, it's all coming up next in this video. So stay tuned. Okay, so starting off with pre-assembled or RTR shocks, you're going to want to inspect them before you add any fluid or before you run the car. If it's an RTR, you'll need to check the areas around the shocks and check for any fluid. If there's any leakage, you'll see it right away. It could be something as simple as something needing to be tightened, or it could be something worse. It could be a damaged O-ring. For pre-assembled shocks like these factory team ones, it's a really good idea to go ahead and take them apart and open up those seals to check for any damage before you fill them up with shock fluid. Once you have the lower shock cap removed, inspect the O-rings to see if there's any small tears. You can also check around the lower cap to see if there's any small bits of rubber on or around the shock shaft. If you see any of that, that means that there's a damaged O-ring in there and you definitely don't want to fill it with fluid. If it all looks good, then all you have to do is just add a little bit of factory team green slime. The green slime does a few things. It lubes the O-rings during assembly. It also adds a bit of an extra barrier against leaks, and it reduces O-ring swell that can cause the shocks to stick or bind. So just put a little dab on the tip of your finger and apply it to the O-ring, and then put the shock cap back on. Ideally, you'd want to pull the O-rings out of the shock if there's more than just one. You want to make sure you get everything all lubed up nice and good. But I'm going to be replacing these stock O-rings, as you'll see in just a little bit. Then once you have the O-rings all lubed up, you can put the shock bottom back on and make sure it's nice and tight. As I mentioned before, I am replacing the stock red O-rings for the factory team low friction X rings. But to install these, I'm going to need to install these washers as well. Man, I'm really noticing in this shot that I really need to get a manicure. So these X-rings will work on any other type of shocks that uses the same size O-ring, but you will probably need to use these washers as well to ensure that you get a proper seal. Of course, the first step is obvious. We're going to need to take these shocks apart. Anytime you work with shocks, you want to make sure that you do everything you can to not damage that shock shaft. Any scratches on the shock shaft can cause it to tear or damage the O-rings inside your shock. If that happens, it'll render those O-rings useless. So just always be careful. It's important. With the rod end removed, you can take the shock cap off and pull out the piston and shaft assembly. So now you can take the shock bottom cap off and remove all the O-rings and spacers. Just like I said before, make sure you try not to scratch anything as you're doing this. Any scratches could cause a leak in the future. You know, I've noticed that most instruction manuals tell you to assemble the shock seal first, then tighten up the lower cap, and then push the shock shaft through the O-rings. This works, but you risk damaging the O-rings this way. The reason this can damage your O-rings is because now you're trying to press a shock shaft through some compressed O-rings. That inner diameter of the O-ring is now smaller than it originally was, which it's supposed to do because it's supposed to tighten up around the shock shaft. But when you try to force a shock shaft through the smaller inner diameter, it can damage the O-ring in the process. My preferred method is to put the shock shaft and piston in first. Then, of course, put some green slime on the threads so that way you don't damage any of the O-rings as you slide them on for the next step. Get a little dab of green slime on your finger. As you can see, this will help pick up the O-rings and small parts. And then make sure that you coat it well, massaging that green slime in there just a little bit, and then slide it over the shock shaft. Then you can follow that up with the spacer and the other O-ring, doing it the same way as we did before. And then, of course, depending on the brand and design of the shock you are working with, this step may be a little bit different. You may only have one O-ring or two O-rings. You might have a couple of additional spacers, but just follow the instructions in your manual. Of course, don't forget that small washer. This is the other reason why I prefer to assemble the shocks this way, because this will ensure that the components are lined up properly inside the shock body. And once I have all the shock seals in place, I can then gently slide them into the shock body and install the lower cap and tighten it up. So moving the piston up and down in this step, it's just something I've done all over the many years. I just simply do this just to check to make sure that nothing is binding, everything moves smoothly. If anything is binding, I can take care of it at this time before I put any fluid in the shock. And all is good, so now it's just time to finish putting the shocks together and filling them with fluid. I'm not going to go into bleeding the shocks here. There are so many different ways to do this depending on the design and the type of shock that you're dealing with. So just follow the instructions in your manual. The main point is just to try to get as much of the air out as possible. Whether you do this with a vacuum pump or if you just use a shock stand like I'm using and just let the bubbles rise to the top. What helps do this is if you move the piston up and down, it'll get that air out from underneath the piston and help those air bubbles rise up. There you go. Super simple, right? This video was helpful. Give it a thumbs up. Also, you know what? Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what other types of how-tos you'd like to see, whether they're building or painting. I want to try to create some videos that you guys will be able to find useful. So that's going to do it for this video. Make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell. We'll see you next time.